We are live.
Hi, guys.
It is. What date is it?
Jill.
It is Wednesday, July 15th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. I'm sitting here with a microphone because I've lost my earbuds. And, you roll with the punches. It is boiling hot in Washington. It is cool and pleasant in Cape Cod, where I'm envious of both of my co-panelists. We are really not allowed to have fun anymore. Ivanka Trump is selling beans. But in lieu of fun, we have Jill Filipovic, which is pretty damn cool. Jill, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kate, why don't you introduce Jill?
Okay, sounds great. I am still hearing the echo. So I mean,
All right, let me figure out. I'm going to turn off my mic while you introduce Jill, and that way the echo will go away, and I may even find my earbuds while you're talking. If I disappear for a second, don't mind me.
hey babe, it's nice to see you.
So good to see your face.
Yeah, it's good to see your face too. Thanks for coming on so short notice. Well, actually, we've kind of wanted to have you on for a while. I know I talked to you about it a couple of weeks ago, and people have been requesting you in the audience. But mostly, I kind of want to talk about your new book. I want to talk about your old book. I kind of want to talk about everything that's been happening the last couple of weeks in terms of current events. For people who don't know,
10 years worth of current events.
10 years worth of current events. For people who don't know Jill is Jill and I met, I guess it would be it's a decade ago, when we were both blogging for Feminist or Feministing or both. And then, and you had gone through law school ahead of me. And then I went through law school after you. And then you had this beautiful kind of arc in your career in which you you'd always been a writer. You'd always been a blogger. You'd always been kind of involved in current events and reporting and being a journalist. And then you I feel like you came out of a top 10 law school. You had pressure to kind of go to a firm or do whatever and make money. And you kind of tried to bridge both worlds for a while. And then you find, actually, I don't think you failed at all. I think that you just kind of decided, in my estimation anyways, I remember talking to you about it actually over charcuterie at, a probably now closed place on Smith Street, that basically, what you were going to do was going to be you were going to go out on your own and kind of become a writer and do this thing. And I remember being very brave and kind of scared. And I was oh man, freelancing is scary. But kind of tell us your path and, why you went to law school to begin with, how you found, I don't even know how you found Feminist and Feministing. I've never heard that story, and I'd be fascinated to hear it. And then how you decided to go back into writing and doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I studied journalism in college, had always wanted to be a journalist. That was the goal. Started blogging in college on a little tiny feminist blog, in part because I ran our school newspapers. I went to NYU undergrad and ran the paper's opinion section. There was a conservative columnist who wrote for me who had his blog, and I had a sort of boring summer job and was constantly commenting on it. And he finally was like, can you just get out of my comments? start your own thing. So I did that. I started a little feminist blog. This was 2003 maybe or 4. Had never read a feminist blog, had never come across one. Started this one and kind of got plugged into this great community of women who are writing online about feminist issues.
So wait a minute. Hang on right there, because you just said something really interesting. You started a feminist blog having never written one, having never read one. What is that? So what did a feminist blog, if you had no models of it, if you had no sense of what the model you were working off of meant, what did what did starting a feminist blog, if we turn back the clock 17, 18 years, what did it even mean to you, the project that you were doing?
Were we that old, Jill? Was
We
it 17
are.
or 18 years
Yeah,
ago?
Oh God,
literally 17 years.
you guys are freaking kids. By the time you were, the time you're reminiscing about, I was already, I already had kids. So chill about the aging thing.
Well, I'd read blogs. I just hadn't read a feminist-minded one. So, and I had also been writing a feminist column for the student newspaper. So I think I sort of treated it as a blend of those two things, if that makes sense. I essentially made it a series of short columns. Whatever I saw in the news that day, usually things that I found, frustrating or enraging, got a few paragraphs of response.
And then what happened? When did you decide to start your own blog?
Yeah, so I started it because I was,
Wait, did you start Feminist?
Writer. I did not start Feminist.
Okay.
Feminist was started by a woman named Lauren Bruce, who's brilliant and incredible. And she, at the time, was a single mom living in Indiana. And she had started Feminist because she didn't really have much of a community there to discuss the kind of issues she wanted to have conversations about. So I found her through, just sort of the feminist blog community. And she asked me to come and join forces with her and kind of co-write and co-edit that blog. So I did that. I think Feminist may be the oldest, or at least one of the oldest feminist blogs on the internet. She started it, I don't know, in like 2001 or something. So she was really a pioneer in that space. So it was very exciting to go write with her. And I wrote there for years, and that kind of turned into a series of opportunities to write for places like The Guardian and the Huffington Post. In the meantime, I'd been studying journalism, had thought I wanted to be a journalist, but this was also, in the years post 9/11 and during the Iraq War. And I essentially watched what I believed to be at the time, and still believe to be, kind of massive failures of journalism as an institution in the lead up to that and the coverage of that conflict. And so essentially decided, I don't know that I really want to go into this field. I don't know that I do completely believe in these norms of objectivity, or at least I don't think they're being executed well. And I'd rather be an advocate. So decided, all right, I'll go to law school, and had big ideas about doing something in international human rights law, which is like every third law student, I think. Went to law school.
So true,
right?
actually, by the way. Oh my God. It's like literally like they're all like, I really want to do human rights law. And I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah. Well, if you gave me a dime for every law student who entered law school thinking they were going into international human rights law and left to do corporate transactional work at Cooley, you could limit the firms to like 5 firms and I would still be very rich.
Yeah, I went and did litigation at Kramer Levin. So there you go.
There you go.
But yeah, essentially went to law school, actually saw what the sort of practice of law looked like, decided, I can do this in a sad basement for $35,000 a year when I'm $200,000 in debt, or I can do it at a big law firm for many, many times that, pay down the debt and figure out what the heck else I want to do. And chose option B. So as I was working at the law firm, I was also writing on the side. And so was trying to kind of begin a freelance career while I was making enough money to pay rent. They were, yeah. The firm was actually great. Really, really great. It just, it was not my life dream, which I think they certainly knew going in, as most firms do. So after about 3.5 years, it just became clear that it was going to have to be one or the other, that, a law firm career and a career as a writer and a journalist was not going to happen. So,
and where were you writing while you were at the firm?
So I was writing for The Guardian pretty regularly. And as I left, I had a conversation with my editor, and they brought me on as a columnist. And so that was kind of my soft landing out of the law firm. You'll be shocked to know being a Guardian columnist does not pay quite as well as, as being a lawyer in Manhattan.
No shit.
But it was at least a way to have, a consistent enough income that I could, pay rent and, eat beans and tuna fish, or whatever the case might have been at the time. And yeah, so then kind of jumped full force into freelancing, which was not easy, and I'd managed to save up some money from working at the firm again to make that a soft landing. And yeah, now have been doing that full time since, God, I don't know, 2012 maybe, is that right?
But not just freelancing. You're the author of a new book.
I am, and
that's coming out in August. And then you also have you published a book 2 years ago. The H Spot.
It came out in 2016, 2017. 2017. It was right after Trump was elected, which was not the best.
Not good for happiness.
Not good for happiness, and not good for a book kind of written on the premise that we were heading in a certain direction when it came to feminism and women's rights. And that, we've now kind of achieved the basics. We need to work toward an affirmative model of happiness. And then Donald Trump. And then it's
immediately the basics come under assault.
Everything came undone. And nobody wanted to read a book about, happiness and feminism.
Well, at least you're not Rebecca Traister. I feel like she wrote her entire her book, and I was just this was all going in a different direction.
Yeah, but she got both of her books have been all three of her books have been amazing. I think Rebecca Traister is doing pretty well.
Oh yeah, no.
And Good and Mad was just absolutely the perfect take on the response to Trump. I don't know if you've read it, but if folks listening have not read it, you should. It's really phenomenal.
So, how do you guys know each other?
Kate and I?
Yeah.
I don't actually remember when we first met. I think you were blogging for Feministing, and you were at TPM, and we maybe got coffee and liked each other.
I was just yeah. I was just kind of I was about to go to law school, and I asked you for a bunch of, advice about kind of going to law school and thinking about journalism and everything else. And you had come out of NYU and gone through this really hard period of harassment while you were there from the auto admit crowd.
Which is back in the news this week.
Is it?
Yeah, the Tucker Carlson writer who was posting those crazy racist things. That's where he was posting it.
He was posting on auto admit?
It's I read that article and I was oh God, I never wanted to see that name again.
Okay, so for those of us who don't know what auto admit is,
to explain this,
and who don't know this story, back up and tell this story. This is totally news to me.
Yeah, so auto admit, God. Auto admit is a message board that is ostensibly for folks who are applying to law school and law students. And the idea is, I don't know exactly why it's called auto admit, but you compare things what are your LSAT scores? What does this school require for admission? There's a lot of obsession around the top law schools and who gets in where and all of that. So I had never heard of it. I'm in law school. I think I was in the second half of my 1L year. And somebody asked me, have you ever heard of this board, auto admit? And I said, no. And they said, well, this is awkward. I don't want to be the one to tell you this, but your name's all over it and it's not great. So you should probably check it out. And so I did. And, I remember I was at home over winter break and I had just gotten my wisdom teeth out. And so I was on various painkillers. And I remember scrolling through and it was this very bizarre out of body experience. Is this actually happening? There are hundreds of threads all about Jill F., things like official Jill Filipovic rape thread, which was just, exactly what it sounds like. People had posted my photos. They had posted my phone number. They posted, about comments I had made in class or I saw her, she's shorter than I thought she was. A lot of rape. Rape was a very significant theme. And just a lot of discussion of, how and where and why to make that happen. None of which is very fun to read about yourself, especially because everybody's posting anonymously. And it was at least obvious that some of those people had actually met me in real life or had seen me, or at least were claiming to have, met me or seen me or interacted with me. So it's this dynamic of, all of a sudden realizing that you're sort of being surveilled and reported on this anonymous site where people are also fantasizing and talking about, physically harming you. Yeah. And so went back to law school, and
but you talk about, like, when we talked about this, you were talking about how, like, much it changed your behavior in being in law school.
Yeah.
Like, you were hiding in sweatshirts, and you, like, felt, like, terrified to speak up in class, and you didn't want to have any type of profile.
But back up a second. What prompted this? Was this just a random kind of drive-by situation, or was it something you had written that had upset people? Was there a precipitating event?
I'm going to say yes and no.
I was saying no. I think no. But anyways, go ahead, Jill. Whatever you think.
I would say certainly the fact that I was a feminist writer on a feminist blog was not helpful. That said, I was certainly not the only person who they harassed. There were a lot of women who were not public in any way, who weren't writing, who became sort of these. There were a few women that became really, really consistent targets, who were referred to by name. Some of those women ended up suing AutoAdmit. I think either
Britton
while
Heller
I was ending
is one of she was a Jane Doe suit, but now she owns it. But Britton Heller was one of the people at Yale who was targeted, specifically sued to de-anonymize people and to de-anonymize the harassers, and successfully de-anonymized them to sue them.
That's interesting. I know Britton, but I did not know that about. I met her when she was working at the Anti-Defamation League, and I knew her in that context, and we've occasionally been in touch since. But I did not know this about her past.
Yeah, I don't want to out her, but I think she outs herself at this point. Yeah, but sorry, but Jill, you guys, but this was a whole thing with AutoAdmit, it specifically with you and Britton and a number of other people, that they just were targeting attractive women and feminist women, outspoken women that were at all of these law schools.
Right. And, not obviously using our full names and posting photos and, doing things like they created hottest girls of and I can't even remember what it is, top 13 or top 15 schools, and went through my photos and found a photo of me in a bathing suit, which they then posted. And it was right when we were interviewing for law firm jobs, and I remember emailing them and just saying, look, I don't really want to participate in your bikini contest, and I'm trying to get a job. And, can you please take this down? And, in response, they posted that email and kind of directed, the hordes back at me. And, it was, that feeling of anyone I talk to might be posting about me online. Anything I say in class is going to go online. In hindsight, that obviously wasn't true, but that's certainly what it felt like, this feeling of being hyper surveilled.
I think it was kind of true, Jill. It could have been true. And I do feel and that's I think that telling these types of stories, and I've always thought that are really really humanize this kind of abuse for people. They do not realize what it's like. And when you say that you went to school dressed in a hoodie and would hide your face and wouldn't speak up in class, people don't realize that those are the effects of this type of abuse, that you self-censor and that you don't participate in the education you're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for, and that's a real thing. And so I don't think that you should minimize that. It's super serious. That was, you kind of came out of that, I think, you did and I wrote about this, I loved how you came out of that. So I'm the light is super weird right now. But how you came out of this, and I'm going to tell the story so we can get to kind of talking about other things. But Jill decided to do this kind of you had the feminist and the feministing crowds. You had this huge internet presence, which other people that Britton did not have. And you kind of staged this brilliant reverse Google bombing, of which you had your name, and for a few weeks or a few months, your name would come up and it would be all this AutoAdmit junk. And you basically got all of the people that loved and followed you and thought that you were wonderful, which there were so many of, to kind of repost and post things that you had said and done that were wonderful. And so that they repopulated Google so that the results were not all about the spamming. And it was I don't think it is like a perfect solution, but it is like, you know, you had a unique position to be able to leverage that. But it was certainly like, I think, a brilliant move on your part of trying to like kind of like fight back against this type of trolling.
Yeah, and I wish I could take credit for it. I did not come up with that by myself. I'm not quite tech savvy enough.
No.
The feminist, I'm 90% sure it was the woman who was the sort of feminist tech support person. And she really did get sort of the whole feminist online community involved in that, which was a just incredible act of kindness. And you're right, like a really, I think, compelling way to push back against that sort of harassment. But I was also, again, you know, lucky that I did have an internet footprint that you could, you know, bring to the fore to kind of tamp down the rest of the auto admit stuff. And that definitely wasn't the case for a lot of the other women that they targeted.
Yeah. So Ben, do you have any questions?
Oh, so many. So when, what is the role that auto admit played this week? And
Yeah.
And how does that connect, or does it connect back to the story you just told?
Yeah, so, you know, auto admit at the time when this was all happening was also this sort of absolutely insane racist cesspool. Like, use of the N-word was rampant.
And it's notionally about law school admissions?
In theory.
So, like, what's the connection between, like, law school admissions? Pardon me, I've never been to law school, and my sense of the law school admissions culture is kind of limited to the engagement with it of students of mine and people who've worked for lawfare. So I have a kind of limited sense of it. But what's the connection between a site devoted to law school admissions and say overt racism or rape fantasies?
I mean, other than lawyers are sociopaths, I'm not totally sure. No, I mean, I think the same thing happened to auto admit and this is my guess, that I think happens to a lot of unmoderated, uncontrolled, free for all internet message boards that allow total anonymity, right? Like Reddit has had some similar problems. That there was definitely a culture of nothing gets quote unquote censored, and you can say whatever you want. And when you give people a forum to do that, it turns out that the worst possible people take it over, and many, many people who are otherwise decent flee, right? And so I would guess that that's what happened to auto admit. And the two guys that ran it, Jarrett Cohen, who I think still runs it, and this guy Anthony Scioli, who I believe is no longer running it, they kind of just let it be a free for all. They decided, like, this is not really our problem. So it was, back then, just a complete, like, pit of racism and misogyny and all those things. And so it was in the news again this week because I'm now blanking on his first name, but Neff is his last name. Writer for Tucker Carlson Tonight, Blake Neff, who was writing for Tucker Carlson, was found by Oliver Darcy at CNN to be posting on auto admit, including posting both on very racist threads and posting racist things himself, and also posting about a young woman he was friends with on Facebook and kind of tracking her life and her dating life and mocking her and, just doing the same kind of ugly stuff that seems to dominate that message board. So it still exists, which was news to me.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I have been around the same time that. So what year was that?
I was in law school from 2005 to 2008.
So that was kind of one of the early heydays of, it's a little bit pre-social media, or it's just at the sort of dawn of social media, but it's at the height of the period where, people could post things to kind of message boards, and you would kind of find out about it when everybody looked at you strangely, which is very much the story that you're telling. So when you look back on it now, this is at a formative time for you professionally. How does it condition who you are?
I think it's certainly instilled unfortunately, sort of a sense of paranoia, which was not great, especially, excuse me.
I don't find you to
When
be
I
a
was-
paranoid person, though. Just like FYI, like as a friend, as like now we've been friends for like a long time, I feel like. And like I've never found you to be paranoid. I actually think you are remarkably trusting of people despite all of these shitty like experiences. So sorry, just to like say that.
Thank you. I think it was certainly, that was more pronounced when I was actually practicing law. I would go to a work event, and if somebody would stare at my name tag for a little bit too long or ask me to repeat my name or say, like, I feel like I've read your name somewhere, my first reaction was like, oh, you've read this horrible message board about me. Like, that's where you know me from. Which is not a great way to be in conversation with people professionally.
And to be clear, how often when you got to reality test that gut instinct, was it in fact right, and how often was it wrong, or did you not get a big enough N on that question to have a sense of it?
Yeah,
It's
I don't know.
one of those things that, like, when my profile got very high around shortly after the Comey firing, I would never know what to make of eye contact with people on the street, right? Was it somebody who was just randomly making eye contact with strangers, which of course happens all the time? Was it somebody who wanted to kill me? Was it somebody who, in DC was more likely to be friendly? And it was a really disorienting experience. I imagine, and I was, 48 or something, 49. I imagine if you're young and, at the early stages of your career, and the subject is not the firing of Jim Comey and you're revealing a bunch of information, but people having, kind of rape fantasies in public about you, that is a much more disorienting experience. So I don't really mean to compare them, except to say that even in, it's disorienting under the best of circumstances. And so I'm just curious, like, did you develop any kind of methodology in your own psychology for sort of reality checking the paranoia?
I think I have since then. And I think being a bit more aware of the answer to your question of how has that affected you, realizing the sort of quickness to defensiveness, to feeling very sort of quickly under siege and not always reacting well to that in the face of especially kind of like group criticism. I certainly never was able to figure out are the people who are looking at my name tag too long recognizing me from this message board. I will say that the two times that I have had a very, very scary like stalker situation, both related back to the message board in some way. I don't know, what exactly that says. But it certainly was something that came into my real life in some pretty significant ways.
It actually says a lot, because
it does.
Because what it says is that there is an X% of the time when you have that queasy reaction that you are A, correct, and it is B, dangerous, which are separate inquiries, right? One is like, what is the chance that the person recognizes you? And B, what is the chance that the person recognizes you? It's a different question with hostility and malintent rather than, say, with sympathy or concern. Those are very different questions. And to have two incidents where you have stalkers and both of them are traced back to that message board situation actually suggests to me that your antenna are pretty good.
Yeah. Jill, I don't want to keep dwelling on this because I know this is like something that you're kind of like part of your past, and we can like kind of, this wasn't like kind of what I wanted to talk about it because I do think it's a fascinating part of your past, and I think that like you have dealt with it remarkably well, and I think it's a really wonderful illustration for people who deal with harassment and trolls, like kind of going forward. And like you have, you're just a model of kind of like owning that this is happening to you and everything else. But I would love to talk about not only your new book, which is like kind of, which first of all, I cannot believe you sent me this draft. I cannot believe it's 300 pages and you wrote this in 3 months. Like, that is insane. She wrote this in 3 months. She got like this contract. She wrote this entire book in 3 months, and it is really good and really, really well researched, and it's full of facts and is super interesting. And it's going to be great for everyone. I have now spent 45 minutes skimming it before this because that was the first time I got it. But I would love to kind of talk about too, like the kind of like the relationship that you have with journalism generally, and kind of like the H-Spot book and like writing your first book and what that was about and like how that kind of felt. I'm terrified of writing a book, and people are trying to get me to write one right now. And I'm like literally fucking terrified. I'm like, no, not going to do it. So like kind of talk about it. Like, what was it like? You went from this freelance lifestyle of wondering if you're going to make enough money to survive, leaving big law, and you kind of took a huge, huge gamble. I think it was so brave. I told you that at the time. It was amazing. It paid off, I think, in huge amounts for you. Tell me how you pitch a book, how you pitched the first book, and then how you pitched the second book.
Yeah, I mean, so both of my book process, I think, was a little different probably than most people's, because I do write opinion stuff online all the time. Both books have kind of come out of articles that I've written, or out of themes that I've been writing about. So, I didn't really do like a super formal, like 100-page book proposal for either project. For the first project, I've been thinking about writing a book for a long time, wanted to pick something that I felt strongly about and that I actually wanted to dedicate, 2 years of my life to doing. And the topic of feminism and pleasure and happiness was one that was always appealing. Wrote that book mostly living in the US, but also as
you were in
Nairobi. Yeah. So I did all the reporting in the US and then wrote a lot of the book actually living in Kenya, which I actually found quite useful. In part,
how so?
I think sometimes getting away from a place that you know so well and that feels kind of so, just is your home, can be really helpful in then looking at it from that sort of outside view. I found it useful to be in Nairobi writing about US politics, right? To not be on the kind of like day-to-day obsessions of Twitter during Eastern Standard Time, and instead have time to actually think about these questions, assess them from, what felt like more of a bird's eye view. So, that felt very useful. But, as I said before, I, wrote a whole book as Hillary Clinton was running for president. All of us, at least I certainly.
What's the H factor? I've always wondered, is the H factor, was that like a tilt towards Hillary? Or is that really, it was just like a play on the G? It was like just happiness, right? Okay, good. I was like, no, she wouldn't have done that. I don't think that. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not that big of a Hillary Clinton fan that I'm going to write.
Yeah, I didn't think you were. Yeah, so I was like, okay. But yeah, no, that and like. And your book was like, I feel like one of the things that I was worried about when you came out with the book, which is like, you were kind of like the H spot, which played on the G spot. I was kind of worried about like the sexualized nature of it for you and like what that meant, given the fact that you'd had all these like kind of like crazy, like kind of like people who had like threatened you in all these ways. I hope that didn't pan out. I hope that you were able to kind of have a mature discussion around that. But what happened is that kind of like, as that played out?
Yeah, I mean, authors don't always get to pick their own titles. I'll say that.
Oh wait. So really?
Look, I didn't dislike the title, but it was not my brainchild, I guess.
Fair enough.
Although, it was certainly a catchy title. So whoever's job it was to come up with it did great. But yeah, so that was always the first question, was like, is this a women and sex book? And it's like, well, no, I mean, yeah, sex is in there because it's pretty hard to talk about feminist issues without talking about sex, and it's hard to talk about pleasure without talking about sex, and most people find those two things to be at least somewhat related. But yeah, it was always kind of the leading question is, tell me this is about more than sex. And I can tell you it was about much more than sex.
It was much more than sex. It was like a very small part was the sex part.
Yeah, so walk us through it. What was it about?
Yeah, so the book was about essentially a model of feminism that doesn't just look at how do we get women to have kind of equal rights in a world that has been built by and for men, but how do we kind of ask that question? Well, what would it look like if women were the ones designing things? If women were the ones determining what our workplaces look like, what our sex lives look like, what our families look like, what healthcare means, how kind of our laws, systems, policies are designed and implemented. And so to get there, I obviously talked to a lot of women, and did a lot of research and reading on what has worked around the world to secure human happiness. Winds up that what makes women happy isn't so much different than what makes men happy. And we have a pretty good idea of what those things are. And then how could we implement those things in the US? So for example, what people in the US really want is more time. We are an incredibly sort of time constrained culture. And that was something that came up over and over in both the interviews that I did and in kind of reading public opinion surveys, that people feel like they are overworked, under-resourced, and essentially because they lack money, have to work longer hours or inconsistent hours, as the case may be for people that are working class, don't have enough hours, and then didn't have time to do the things that brought them meaning, right? So spending time with their families, eating healthy, having sex, listening to music, creating art, doing all those kind of things that are like the next level of hierarchy on, the Maslow's pyramid, right? And so the book was really looking at, how do we kind of build up that whole base so that people can then, and women especially, realize greater potential.
Jill, may I dare to say, and I've meant to mention this to you for a while, that but you reminded me that you went into law school with the international human rights thing, and so now I have to mention it. May I dare say that you have found your way back to that entire thesis now as a journalist and writing that book? Like you really seriously did. You found your way back to like an international human rights perspective. Of writing about writing the H Spot is like very much a story of human rights and very much a story of kind of the rights of like individuals to make themselves happy and to make themselves like comfortable. And yeah, I think that I don't know. I dare say that the 2008 version of you would be very proud.
So I love the focus on happiness. I think, it is a subject. Literally, as recently as yesterday, I had a professional development conversation with somebody, and I always talk about happiness as sometimes I abbreviate it as fun, as the sort of great underappreciated professional value, and that we talk, and when we talk about professional development and sort of what people want in a career, we talk about, security, we talk about money, we talk about prestige, we talk about, sometimes we, in these very arch terms, we talk about making a contribution or doing good in the world. But we don't usually talk about I guess because it sounds sort of hedonistic to talk about fun or, I want to enjoy myself and be happy. Because it sounds frivolous. And I actually think it's a supremely deep value. And I think that's true in the professional context, but it's also true in a lot of other contexts. And, if you Jonathan Rauch has written a whole book about this, which I, actually a lot of what you're saying resonates with. But I really think it's something we don't like. Basic happiness is something we don't talk about enough.
And then I think we don't necessarily even understand well, right? So, are we talking about, and philosophers kind of put this into two categories, right? Like hedonistic pleasure. So things that feel good on your five senses, right? Eating good food, listening to beautiful music, having good sex, touching something that feels nice, all of those things. And then there's this sort of, and I have still not figured out how to say this word, so I'm going to embarrass myself, but the more like eudaimonic happiness, which is a bit more about living a life that feels meaningful, having interesting experiences, learning new things, stretching your abilities and your intellect. And that doesn't always mean that experience is going to be immediately pleasurable, right? Sometimes it's actually quite challenging and quite hard. And a meaningful life doesn't necessarily mean a life that is easeful, or a life that is always full of hedonistic pleasures. But I don't think you can have a meaningful life without enjoying some of those hedonistic pleasures, right? And I think it's awfully hard to have a life that you would consider, hedonistic and sort of the positive meaning of it, without also having a life that feels morally and philosophically meaningful and interesting. And so I think when we talk about happiness, we do often talk about it in this very flippant way of like, okay, you want to ride a unicorn and pet a kitten, like that's not really, I think, what those of us who talk about happiness as an essential goal, essential life goal, really mean. I think we are more talking about, okay, how do we combine both pleasurable day-to-day experiences, and also a good life, a meaningful life, a big life, an interesting life. And my computer's about to die, so my husband has now come in to give me the cord. So sorry that you're seeing him in the background.
Excellent. So speaking of unicorns, we have a person for whom happiness always implies unicorns.
Absolutely.
To ask a question. Maggie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben and Kate. This is very exciting because, Ben, I don't even think you know this, but someone bought the H spot for me almost immediately after it came out. And I run a business called NatSec Girl Squad. And it is really kind of based off of what I learned from the H spot and this same idea of like, women want what men want, which is to be happy. And to us, that means something different. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. And I'm curious, like, obviously you're writing more now than you're lawyering, but how much of that version of feminist, what it means to be a feminist and to be actively a feminist in your life was shaped by the particular professional space you were in, right? Because in the national security space, like there's a particular idea of what it means to be a woman, and it doesn't really include purple hair and unicorns for most.
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
But before you answer that question, I just want to say, like, so Maggie is somebody who has run. She sort of talks about it as a business called NatSec Girl Squad, but it is actually a really substantial project in trying to create opportunities for particularly younger women in the national security field. And so actually says a lot to me that it was conceptually inspired by your book. And that was, as Maggie says, something that I'm on Maggie's board and I care about this project a lot. It's something that I did not know until this moment.
And that's amazing and incredibly flattering. So thank you for that, Maggie.
It's not surprising, Jill. It's a great book. And it's like you always do a smart job of threading these really thoughtful issues without being like knee jerk about it. And like it makes complete sense to me that this is how it is. Sorry. I'm just like fangirling, but like I also am just like very like I'm like that makes me happy. Like Maggie saying that, I didn't know that either. And that like makes me really happy.
That's a very kind thing to say. Yeah, so, in terms of how that professional experience shaped my understanding of feminism, I think it was profoundly useful. I'd never been in a corporate environment before going to a law firm. And I think seeing the ways in which, in some ways really positively, I think feminist discourse and norms have been, folded in to some degree, to how women, and to a much lesser extent men, in that workspace understood women's rights, understood feminism, understood kind of quote unquote gender empowerment, women's empowerment, a term that I hate. But also kind of how that it did get just very much flattened and folded in within this frame of this is kind of women's problem to solve. The number of times that I went to a panel discussion about, how women could balance work and life. And it's like, or we saw a woman ask that question, how do you balance work and family or whatever? And it's like, well, nobody asked men that question because the answer is my wife figures it out. And over and over, that's also sort of just what I saw in real time, right? Like all of the female partners, of which there are relatively few, which is true of every law firm, had husbands who also worked outside the home. And many of the male partners had wives whose full-time job it was to manage the home, right? And so that meant that the female partners were being requested to mentor the younger female associates who, unlike the female partnership, were 50% female, right? Or more than 50% female. So there was this huge number of young associates who want mentorship from a very small number of women at the top. Those same women were, both managing the usual demands of being a partner at a law firm, while also trying to get home and, make dinner and feed their kids and read a bedtime story and then get back on the laptop at 9 or 10 p.m. And that was always the story of like, this is how I manage it. Whereas a lot of that at-home labor for men was just totally invisibilized. It was obscured because there was usually a woman doing it. And usually that woman was a wife. And I think often, in all cases, it was also people that were being paid to do that work. Which all, people also don't really like to talk about. But, what I noticed is that, it was a problem of the ways that our workplaces have been set up with certain assumptions of who does what, and an assumption of a full-time male breadwinner and a full-time, at home kind of helpmeet for him. And that women were being told, okay, slot yourself into this system that was not built in a way, it wasn't built for you. And then figure out how to solve the problems that come forward, and have like a women's identity group or whatever, and talk about how you can find balance. And it was just such like clear and total bullshit. Am I allowed to swear?
Yes. Why do people ask that? Yeah. Like, I'm swilling a beer over here. You're fine.
And so that to me was I think quite demonstrative of how these issues are still, and certainly were at the time, talked about in not just corporate settings, but in kind of any workplace settings, and how very, very much we repeatedly in nearly every feminist issue pretend like, men don't exist in the calculus of gender equity. And it's up to women to figure out how to, solve the problem and achieve what men have achieved when we've set up a system for men to achieve what they've achieved based on a whole universe of invisible female labor. So it's going to be impossible. And so I don't know that totally answers the question. But that was certainly kind of my feminist takeaway from working at the law firm. And, definitely informed the way I think about these questions, and how I try to talk to them, how I try to talk about them to folks who work in like normal corporate spaces and aren't spending half their day on like feminist Twitter.
So let me ask you something. That resonates with me a lot. And I'm also a little bit curious about the question of how you would design a feminist big law firm. So like, I think I actually agree with everything you said about the assumptions of law firms, about where their labor is coming from and what the support structures are. I don't think you're misstating or exaggerating or misemphasizing anything. And yet I'm trying to imagine if Arnold and Porter called you up tomorrow and said, okay, we need to be competitive in the marketplace, but we want to be a feminist big firm. What does it look like?
I mean, I don't think it does.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. I was like,
I think
dozen parts.
Yeah. A big part of this, I think we often think about these solutions as being piecemeal. And the reality is, we have to fix problems where we see them, right? Like, I get very frustrated with the progressive mantra of like, everything is systemic. We can only fix things on like the big picture scale because, well, at some point you have to start somewhere. But I do think that we do need to fix things on a big picture scale as well. And that you're not going to be able to have something like a feminist law firm unless we pretty radically reform what work looks like generally, what gender relations look like, what our families look like. That said, on a small scale, if Arnold and Porter or whoever was to come to me and say, what are some things we could do to make this place better? I would say things like formalizing mentorship programs that aren't necessarily focused on, gender pairing, right? Which is certainly how it played out. I think how it plays out at a lot of law firms. I would say being cognizant of how, for example, being like a part-time partner actually means that you are mommy tracked and you're still working, 5 days a week. You're just not working 7 for a tiny slice of the pay. I think there's a lot of things that companies can do on a small scale that will make kind of incremental differences. But I'm not sure that what any individual corporation or company could do is going to be the kind of, radical change that would actually enable women to be anything closer to equal. That's sort of a depressing answer, but
it is a little
depressing answer, and I kind of want to resist it. I'm not sure I have a good pushback to it, but it bothers me.
I mean, I think one thing that is huge, a place that we see where gender inequalities really become pronounced is when women have kids. And so thinking about how any company or any organization can help to make that less of a kind of pronounced point of deviation between men and women. And I think one way you can do that is really incentivizing men taking parental leave and taking it early. One of the biggest drivers of inequality in the home, which then ends up becoming replicated as inequality in the workplace, is that in those first few weeks of a new baby, it's almost always mom and usually just mom at home. And so she just learns how to do stuff, right? It's not that women are inherently like better at taking care of small creatures. It's that, you learn by practice and repetition. And so, and the baby gets used to the person who's taking care of it. And so it just becomes easier for mom to get up in the middle of the night to give the baby a bottle. It becomes easier for mom to change the diaper. The baby's less likely to cry when mom is holding it. And I'm using mom and dad here, but, this could be kind of any primary parent. And then what ends up happening, women obviously are much more likely to take parental leave than men are, even though women in the US certainly don't get enough and many don't get to take much at all. And that has these kind of residual effects, right? Where then when it becomes time for everybody to go back to work and there's no childcare, childcare is very expensive. It just makes more sense for mom to go part-time or mom to drop out of the workforce entirely, which has huge long-term effects, not just on earnings, but also on happiness. Full-time stay-at-home mothers are more likely to suffer from depression and, a whole series of psychological ailments than women who work outside the home. Men who have full-time stay-at-home wives are less likely to promote female employees and are less likely to pay them fairly. So all in women or children of, mothers who work have all kinds of positive outcomes. Girls do better in school. Boys are more likely when they grow up to pitch in around the house and to do their fair share of childcare and housekeeping. So all of these things are pretty deeply interconnected. All of which to say, to the extent to which law firms or any other company can make sure that they are both giving all parents adequate time at home with new kids, and also specifically incentivizing that men take that time. And I think a huge factor in that is having senior men who take that time and don't just take like 2 weeks, certainly take at least 2 weeks at the very beginning, but then take, months, and taking those very early first weeks. It sounds like a small thing, but it does have these really tremendous ripple effects.
It doesn't sound like a small thing at all. It sounds like a huge thing. And I want to kind of wrap up to pivot towards your new book. And I can't believe that you've written this in such a short amount of time. I think that we talked about 2 months ago, a month ago, and you were like, "Oh yeah, I'm writing." Yeah, and time means nothing. And I was just kind of like, "Well, you are going to have like this huge thing that's going to happen, and you're going to be focusing on this project in all of these different ways." And you've done that, but then I think that I can't believe that I literally looked at this book and it's 300 pages. And it really focuses on a tremendous area that I think needs to be addressed, which is that it's called Okay Boomer, which I think Maureen Dowd would be so proud. I know, I feel like she really, I want to hear your take on whether she ushered that phrase into the real kind of existence, or if I'm imagining that. But I feel like she wrote that one column, and I feel like all of a sudden everyone started using that term. But your book is called Okay Boomer, and it is a really smart, really thoughtful kind of conversation between the generations that shows older generations and I read the conclusion, and I read 2 chapters. I read the housing chapter because my property background, and I read the chapter on voting, and then I was just kind of this was, and it was amazing. And they're just chock full of statistics and really great interviews. And I think that it's going to be wonderful. But I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. Writing that right now seems almost I don't know. I feel like maybe you're I feel like it's a recapitulation of the H spot. You're just writing this into this ether of people that need to hear this type of thing, but are they going to hear it? That's kind of how I feel.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways I feel like this book, well, in a lot of ways, as I was writing it, just became increasingly relevant, which is always a good feeling to have when you're working on a big project. And I think certainly with coronavirus hitting, and then, with this incredible upswing in the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, a lot of the themes that I touch on in the book, I think, are quite relevant to those 2 things. First and foremost of which is the fact that one of the primary reasons why millennials are doing so badly, and we're the first generation that's going to do worse than our parents, and we'll probably do worse than our grandparents. And if it wasn't for, our social welfare system, we would be the most impoverished generation since, those who came of age during the Great Depression. So, we're not doing great. And, there are economic reasons for that. But a huge reason for that is that we're also the most diverse adult generation in the U.S. And so
this is a beautiful part of the book, which is that you have all of these really kind of very simple, but very detailed and very well-sourced diagrams that show how people how the diversity of populations have changed. And I have never seen that before, Jill. It's a really great addition to the conversation.
I hope so. And, I obviously write a lot about social justice issues. It's, not writing about race and gender is not new, but looking at how kind of cross-generationally, and I'm going to have to learn how to say that word without tripping up as I promote this book, the degree to which, American racism, formal, informal, legal, individual is essentially kind of now all crystallizing, I guess, among millennials. And you see the generation-wide effects of that. Boomers are, about 80% white. Millennials are nearly, we're sort of just over 50% white. So that's a huge shift between our parents and us. And as the result of systematic discrimination in housing, in healthcare, in jobs and hiring and college admissions and education, and all of the things that we always talk about, as a result of that, since even before the US was founded, we now have a very diverse generation that is really floundering because so many of us, came from families that did not have the kind of generational wealth that white families have, right? Their families weren't able to build that wealth because of, for example, housing discrimination, right? And that your house is usually your biggest piece of wealth. So had to take out more loans to go to college. We're more likely to go to predatory for-profit colleges, which are more expensive and have very, very low graduation rates. So African Americans in particular, but also Latino Americans, have much lower graduation rates. So you're less likely to graduate and then more likely to be in debt without a college degree, right? So then you're starting your working life without a degree, but but already in the hole.
All of this debt, yeah.
Right. So then, you're also facing racial discrimination in hiring and pay. So you're making less money for doing the same job, right? When you already have less to begin with. Then if you are trying to build your assets by, say, buying a home, first of all, African Americans are charged more for rent for sort of comparable apartments or houses in comparable neighborhoods compared to whites. So you have more outlays of expenses. And then when you're trying to buy a home, you're more likely to be targeted for a subprime mortgage. And, you're essentially not getting as fair of a deal. You're less likely to be offered a home, in a neighborhood where that home is going to grow its value. It's just sort of, from top to bottom, millennials generally have been screwed by sort of changes in the economy, by the sort of Reaganization of American politics, the destruction of the social safety net. But people of color in the US have been sort of specifically extra targeted by all of those things. And because millennials are more diverse, you see that across our generation playing out much more pronouncedly than in any generation before.
And when you say people of color, we use that as a sort of umbrella term, sometimes to refer to non-white minorities. Is that an overgeneralization? I mean, is that true of Asian Americans, South Asians, or is it really a creature of African Americans, Latinos, and Native populations?
It's a good question. So some of these statistics aren't broken out that way, so I don't know the answer to that. In some, for example, I think in pay, you see African Americans and Latinos who are hit particularly hard by pay discrimination. You don't see Asians, for example, hit as hard. But when it comes to things like housing discrimination, you do see Asian Americans suffering from that form of from housing discrimination. And so it can be, a bit specific. It's also the reality that tons of Americans are multiracial, right? So a lot of these categories, Latino, African American, white, Asian, many people fit into multiple of them, right? And aren't just kind of one thing. So all of the lines around how we create these categories are messy and often changing. Typically our social science research does not catch up as quickly as our realities do. And so it's a good question. And, unfortunately, I'm not a social scientist, so I'm relying on other people's research and categorizations. And so I, often use a term like people of color to kind of encompass non-white populations that face sort of similar challenges. But obviously all of these terms are not ideal and not particularly precise.
So we have to wrap up, but my last question was like, Larry Lessig came on a few weeks ago and was like, basically old people have to die and stop voting. My son just said, okay, boomer to me, and it's the best thing that he could have ever said. I support him. I should be irrelevant. Everyone older than me should be irrelevant. We should take ourselves out of the voting population. It was, okay, to be fair, it was a very radical thing to say. But I'm kind of curious, like, what you think of that as, like, we kind of, like, end the conversation.
Yeah, so maybe this will be a bit of an olive branch to the boomers. But, I think one thing that makes boomers unique is that they are certainly the most politically polarized generation. I think we think of boomers as quite conservative. And that's true. They certainly are more conservative than millennials, who are quite liberal. But you see boomers kind of really hewing to the extremes on the political polls, and more of them kind of hew to a conservative side. But you've got a solid chunk of boomers, it's not half, but it's close to half, who are much more progressive. And so to me, the task is not saying all boomers need to die off, and once they're gone, everything will be great. It's more to say, how can we learn from those, elder boomers who have been doing this work for a long time? There's a guy I interviewed for the book named Jeff Robinson, who's a guy I've known ever since I was a little kid. And, he was one of the first kids to integrate his public high school in a private high school in Memphis, Tennessee. He's been on the front lines of the fight for criminal justice. He's a criminal defense lawyer out in Seattle. He's somebody who, yes, he is a boomer, and he has an incredible wealth of life experience to share. He's somebody that's been working on prison reform, well before there was a defund the police hashtag, right? And so a lot of the media coverage does focus on that conservative half of the boomer generation who have done tremendous harm to the US and the millennials specifically. And I don't want to underplay that. And they certainly get their feet held to the fire in the book. But there are also a huge number of baby boomers who are doing incredible work today, who have been on the front lines of these fights for racial equality, for gender equality, for LGBT rights. And what I would like is to really have those folks, not just continuing to stand up and kind of share what they've learned, but being thoughtful about, how can we pass the mic now to this younger generation? And, I'm also 36, so millennials are not that young. How can we power share? Congress is overwhelmingly boomer. Boomers, unfortunately, I'm not saying they need to go die, but I do think that boomers should consider, how can we step back? How can we actually let, today's young adults into these positions of power? How can we support them? How can we kind of help to sort of pull them up and share, our knowledge and experience with them? Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, that's really what's missing, even from boomers who are left of center.
Yeah, I think that's
so. We got to wrap, but when is the book out?
August 11th, but you can pre-order it now.
You will not believe how fast you wrote this book and how good it is. I'm not just saying that.
We have shared the link both on the Crowdcast and on YouTube, where there is a lively discussion of all kinds of things that are extraneous to this. And I want to warn our YouTube viewers, I got wrapped up in this conversation, so I did not police the completely irrelevant discussions going on. In the future, I, always reserve the right to remove people from that conversation when they are being disruptive. And who I'm talking. I'm talking about you if you're one of them. Jill Filipovic, this has been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Next time I'll talk less.
No.
Oh my God.
You're the guest. You're supposed to talk a lot.
Yeah, you're supposed to talk all the time. And also, next time we're going to have you on after your book is published, and we're going to talk about generations. And like whether they actually exist.
You know who hates generations the most are boomers.
You know,
Maybe I'm a
not
boomer.
I am not a boomer. I'm a Gen Xer, and as I am really conscious of the difference between boomers and Gen Xers. We often get grouped together, but we're really culturally different. And, you know, it's not a shallow cultural difference. It's a big cultural difference. And I would defend the existence of certain generational things. But that is a conversation for a different day. Please come back after the 11th when the new book is out. Kate, we don't know who's showing up tomorrow, do we?
Nope, no idea.
It's going to be, I'm not sure what word we're allowed to use because we're not allowed to use the word fun, but I'm sure it'll be of value. So, Kate, until then, 22 hours and 49 minutes from now, what's the good word?
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, okay, boomer, let's talk.
Cheerio.
Bye, Jill. Thanks for coming on.
Bye.
You're amazing.
Thank you so much.